Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of Ponsonby and Massie, a new podcast focusing on politics in Scotland and politics viewed from Scotland. I'm here with Bernard Ponsonby, formerly political editor at STV and a legend in the Scottish broadcasting and journalistic firmament. So Bernard, how's your weekend been?
Absolutely first class, I have to say. Where are you? Because normally when we do these things, I see a sort of bookcase behind you which says erudition, but you've got closed curtains. Should we know something salacious here?
Oh, absolutely. No. I've decamped to the Isle of Jura for a mid-election break. Well, not so much a break in terms of not doing any work, but a shift in perspective to view the election from the peace and tranquility of the Southern Hebrides, which offers a degree of perspective.
How very Orwellian on, I think, well, it's an anniversary, isn't it? It's an anniversary.
Absolutely. Yes, it's the 75th anniversary this weekend of the publication of 1984, which, of course, George Orwell wrote at Barnhill, a farmhouse at the north end of the island, just 5 or 6 miles north of where I am just now, and where, in certain respects, not very much has changed since 1948 when he was writing the novel.
Absolutely, indeed. And I think that one of the aspects of government over the course of the last 14 years is the way in which the issue of control and control of thought has been a big issue. Hey, but that's a separate podcast. Let's leave that for another day. For another day. What's exercising you this weekend?
Well, Big Brother is always with us, isn't it? No, I mean, if we're going to sort of look over the last few days of the election campaign and see what has changed, if anything has changed, what might have a material impact on the election outcome, the headline story of the last few days, I think, is quite clearly Rishi Sunak's extraordinary decision to cut short his attendance at the D-Day commemorations in Normandy. I was at an event in the village hall in Craighouse last night and speaking with people who take an interest in politics but would not consider themselves to be anoraks or obsessives or anything remotely like that. It was striking that this is an issue that, as they say, has cut through with the general public. Multiple people raising it unprompted and sharing, really, I think, the bafflement that people would think, well, hang on a minute, you're Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. The 80th anniversary of D-Day is not a surprise. It's not something that has snuck up on you. Everybody else is there, including Keir Starmer, for the whole day. Why weren't you? It seems utterly illogical and baffling, I think, to many people. I'm not suggesting it will necessarily change people's minds in as much as people who were previously minded to vote Conservative now won't. But it just makes no sense.
I think that the lesson from this, or the question that emerges from this, is that does he actually understand politics at all? I mean, forget whether you come from the political left or the political right. I mean, forget the left-right divide in politics. I mean, there was perhaps an unusual unity, understandably, in British politics at that time when you were defeating fascism in the 30s and the 40s. And if you're a prime minister or a leader of the opposition, or you represent any political party, and you're meeting people who went through the most traumatic time in the history of these islands in the last century, and you know that these young men, these very young men, and these veterans were very young men who served with people who were comrades and friends, and they didn't come back with them. And the emotional effect of that on these veterans, I don't know what it is. Nobody can know what it is unless you were actually there. And therefore there should be, and I think it's appropriate to say, an extra reverence to citizens of the country who fought to save the country from fascism. That's the issue. And therefore, if you understand the sacrifice that was made by people who gave their lives in defense of a set of values, and veterans who carry them on, any prime minister who thinks it was ever appropriate in any circumstances to leave any event has absolutely no political judgment.
Yeah, and that I think is the the secondary question that then applies to this, isn't it? That people say, well, actually, how come Rishi Sunak has become prime minister without having what appear to be pretty elementary, primary school level political instincts?
Absolutely. And there's perhaps a wider question, which is that if you're a political leader in a campaign, let's try and sort of look at this from the perspective of trying to give him some sympathy, although the decision doesn't deserve any sympathy. If you're a political leader in a general election campaign, you're told you have to be here at 1 o'clock, you have to be here at 2 o'clock, you have to be here at 3 o'clock, you have to be here at 4 o'clock. And your entire day is managed for you. You literally don't have time to think. You don't have time to think. I've been up close with these individuals and watched them over the years. That's the way that it happens. But here's the thing. Even if the Prime Minister had said, I've got this ITV debate, he will have umpteen advisors who are there to say, you cannot do that. You cannot do that. You make ITV come to you in a date which is consistent with your diary. And so it's not only a judgment about the Prime Minister, it's also a judgment about those around him. And if I was a Conservative, I would say that's really worrying.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole thing, it reminded me of something I was once told by a school teacher at Winchester who taught Rishi Sunak when he was a young boy. And that teacher said, that of Sunak, his thought processes, though acute, are not very versatile. He seems stuck in mathematics, or as some might say, in the left hemisphere of the brain, i.e. that he lacks the sort of emotional capacity or the capacity to engage with people empathetically, emotionally, to really understand the stuff of life, which is what politics is. It's not just something that can be reduced to data and to spreadsheets and mathematical formulae and so on. It is the stuff of everyday life. And that, if you like, emotional or imaginative aspect of politics, that connection with voters is what all the most successful politicians have. And I'm not suggesting that Keir Starmer has necessarily shown in this campaign that he has that, but I think we can certainly say that Rishi Sunak does not.
And on social media, I saw one of these, they're all sort of faked up by people from a certain political perspective. And it just said, on D-Day, he ran away. And it's one of those issues where you don't have to understand the nitty-gritty of politics. You don't have to understand all of the details about the debates which take place about tax. The optics of it are just absolutely deplorable. And somebody said this is Rishi Sunak's Michael Foot moment. And the Michael Foot moment was turning up to the cenotaph in 81 in a so-called donkey jacket. By the way, it wasn't a donkey jacket. It wasn't a donkey jacket. And Michael Foot actually, as he's said, after this Remembrance Sunday, the Queen Mother complimented him on the warmth of the jacket. But the fact is that the
damage had been done by then,
the damage had been done, and the damage has been done.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, a friend of mine said to me, look, they've announced that 316 people crossed the English Channel on small boats on the 80th anniversary of D-Day and so on. But actually, it's 317 if you include the Prime Minister. It's just baffling. I mean, I don't think it's going to sink the Conservatives' election chances, because those were torpedoed by Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. And all that we could say of Rishi Sunak is that he has failed to undergo the necessary repairs at sea that would have kept the Conservative Party afloat. But it does confirm, I think, people's sense that, oh, for heaven's sake, what are they going to do next? We've had enough of this shower. Let's sweep them out, get somebody else in the interests of democratic hygiene, if nothing else. And that, I think, is the thing that is really crucifying the Conservatives at this election.
Yeah, and it leads us on to another issue, which is Reform UK and Nigel Farage, because this is a gift. Now, I always thought it was the case that when he declared, and he was always going to declare, let's not if you know the way in which the system works, this whole idea from Farage that, oh, my political days are behind me, and yes, I'll support Reform UK, there has been a very, very distinct choreography in the whole campaign of Reform UK, which is all about doing maximum damage to the Conservative Party. But, you know, the Reform UK agenda is not a sort of let's get the spirit of Brexit and take it to the Tory party and say to the Tory party, you've been bad on this, you still believe in a big state, you still can't cut taxes, we are the real Conservatives in the election. In a sense, ostensibly, that is what the Reform UK agenda is all about. But it's not. It's absolutely nothing to do with that at all. What this is about is a post-election agenda, and it's about realigning the right in politics. And if Reform cannot overtake the Conservative Party, and they will not, never, because even in Labour's darkest days, as Margaret Thatcher said, the Labour Party will be a long time a-dying. That was after 83, and of course it did revive. The Conservative Party, and you've got all these, and the Sunday papers today, are we witnessing the end of the Conservative Party? Of course you're not. This is all rubbish. But the Reform UK agenda is about recalibrating the political right in Britain after the election, and it's about ensuring the centre of gravity in the Conservative Party is way more to the right than it is at the moment. That's the Farage agenda. That is absolutely the Farage agenda.
Oh, yeah.
Let me ask you a question, Alan.
It's a sort of hostile takeover, isn't it?
Where does it go? Where does it end?
I mean, it's curious. I mean, there are some people on the left who sort of, constantly going on, why are you talking about Farage? He's never won election as an MP. He's lost, 7 times? And although he may win in Clacton, his electoral track record in certain respects is not distinguished. His party is a minority enthusiasm. Why does he get so much airtime? There's almost a sense, I think, you get from some people on the left that Reform, or previously UKIP, are a kind of media creation, that they shouldn't be given the amount of airtime they receive. And of course, it is true that in Scotland they're a minority taste because there's relatively little space in Scottish politics for an English nationalist party. That's breaking news, a world exclusive from Ponsonby and Massie there. But nevertheless, south of the border, there is no doubt that Farage speaks to a particular constituency. You don't get to be polling 12, 15, even 18% in opinion polls without being a figure of some relevance and importance. And it's a politics based on a sort of sense of resentment more than anything else, a fear that someone else is having a good time at your expense. And that politics can be reduced to, simplicity, which we know it can't, and government certainly can't. So to your question about... sorry about it, yeah.
I mean, give me your take. I'll give you my take. I'll tell you what I think Nigel Farage's end game is. Yes, he tapped into populist sentiment about the European Union. Of course the European Union was remote. Of course the European Union compromised national sovereignty. And of course, if you whip up a head of steam, which says we need to take back control of people that we didn't elect. Well, we actually elected some of them, unless I'm mistaken, because I went out and cast my ballot in European elections. We did elect some of them. You take populist issues, and when it comes to the issues of should you be masters of your own destiny, that is an incredibly populist message which people respond to. But let's just take it a stage further. He not only believes in coming out of the European Union, he believes in not a centre-right, he believes in a right-wing agenda, which, if the Conservative Party had to dance to a Farage tune, that you would not be increasing any money at all at this election on the National Health Service. You would be moving to a system of social insurance. You would be looking at anything in this country where the state and the public sector has a role, and you would be market testing, not one thing, but everything. And you would be moving to a libertarian model of a market economy, which is way outside anything which the Conservative Party in this country has ever believed in. It goes way beyond even what Margaret Thatcher is. Now, that is my take on where he actually wants to take the Conservative Party.
I think you give Farage a bit too much credit there, Bernard, by suggesting there is if you like, an intellectual coherence to reform's agenda. I don't see that at all. I don't see Farage as a libertarian by any stretch of the imagination. I think that's a caricature of libertarian thought. But rather that Farage is a straightforward European hard right politician. He is not that different from the people in the Alliance for Deutschland. He is not that different from aspects of the Front National in France. In a curious way, Farage is a much more European politician than most people in the Conservative Party, or many people in the Conservative Party. And, it is this sense of resentment, this fear that somebody else is gaining at our expense. And, in that sense, Farage's nationalism is no different from any other type of nationalism, really, albeit it may be expressed more stridently, more vulgarly than some people. But I don't think that there is, if you like, a sort of coherent agenda to dismantle the estate, the apparatus of the state. What is interesting is after the election is how does the Conservative Party respond to defeat, and what sort of Conservative Party is left? There is clearly going to be a degree of pressure from some parts of the Tory press, particularly in the Telegraph, I think, to say that, well, we lost because we didn't go right wing enough. We betrayed the principles of true conservatism. That is not an analysis that I think will hold any water whatsoever. The Conservatives' problems at this election stem from two things fundamentally, in my view, and see what you may disagree with this, but first, they've been in power for too long, and secondly, they have been shown to be incompetent too many times over too many years on too many issues of significant public importance. And you put those two things together, and the problem is not an intellectual or an ideological problem. It's not a refutation of conservative thinking at this election. It's a refutation, a repudiation of this iteration of the Conservative Party, where it is now after 14 years in power.
I agree with both of those points. And you did mention the sainted Daily Telegraph. In the interests of being across absolutely everything, I read the Telegraph. I read the Telegraph every day. I also read the readers' comments on the Telegraph absolutely.
Oh, you're a braver man than I, then.
And can I just say, I mean, and here's the thing. The Conservative Party the Daily Telegraph comes to the aid of the Conservative Party belatedly in this campaign, when all of their columnists and all of their leader writers, and if you take what these comments say as indicative of the readership, absolutely want the Conservative Party dead and buried at this election because they believe they've ceased to be conservative. And I just think that the issue is that a number of them will vote for Reform UK, but they will vote for Reform UK as a catalyst to change the mainstream Conservative Party. And if you go back through the history, even the recent history from the One Nation conservatism of Macmillan and Douglas Hume through to the Thatcher was about redefining the economic orthodoxy. We're not going to put money into loss-making industries. We're going to recalibrate the relationship between labour and capital by having trade union reform and all the rest of it. Even if you go from the Tory reform group right the way through to people that would call themselves heirs of Thatcher, the Reform UK agenda takes it way beyond that. And I think if the Conservative Party post-election, because they are going to lose, embrace some of this stuff, they will be ensuring that Keir Starmer gets a second term.
Yeah, that is the most likely outcome. I mean, it is a cliche, but cliches are cliches because they're based on truth. But elections in British politics tend, most of the time, to be won from the centre. In fact, it's very difficult to think of any recent examples where that hasn't been the case. And just as the Labour Party consigned itself to the wilderness by scampering off to the left, both in the 1980s and then under Jeremy Corbyn, so there is obviously a temptation for the Conservative Party to do something similar after the election. But a lot will depend on the balance of those Conservative MPs that survive this cull, because it's not necessarily obvious that the parliamentary Conservative Party that survives will if you like, be more right-wing than the current Conservative parliamentary party. So, that is something that remains to be seen, and a leadership contest will then become a discussion about, well, what is the meaning of conservatism as an opposition, but also over the next 5 and possibly 10 years.
Just one thought.
I'm sorry, Bernard, on you go.
Just one thought on that the Conservatives are going to lose this election because the Parliamentary Conservative Party post-2010 has been a party essentially at civil war. It's been at civil war over Brexit, over a hard Brexit. That means Theresa May is no longer Prime Minister. It puts in a sort of buffoon as Prime Minister in Boris Johnson, but his populism gets them over the line in 2019. The Parliamentary Conservative Party is paying the price at this election for its own divisions. And in that sense, I think that Sunak is almost irrelevant in terms of where they end up. But the Parliamentary Conservative Party could be so small after this election that the real debate about the future of the Tory party isn't to be fought within the Parliamentary Party, it's to be fought among the membership. And this is a membership that thought that Liz Truss was worthy of the role of Prime Minister. So who knows?
I mean, in fairness, they had an unappetizing choice. I mean, events have demonstrated that Rishi Sunak perhaps wasn't the great alternative to Liz Truss that he hoped to be. That's all true, though, I think. But if we're talking about the Tories, perhaps we should say a word or two about their situation in Scotland, where Douglas Ross has manoeuvred himself to become the candidate for the Conservative Party in Aberdeenshire North and East Murray, isn't it? One of these absurdly long new constituency names. The sitting MP there, David Duguid, has been unwell with a spinal illness for some months and is currently in hospital in Glasgow. But he, with the backing of his local Conservative association, insisted that he was fit to stand for election, although he wouldn't necessarily be out pounding the pavements. He was nevertheless, in a state to be the candidate. But the Tory party management board in Scotland decreed otherwise and decided that he's not well enough to stand. And coincidentally, perhaps, Douglas Ross pops up and says, well, if we're in a hole and there's a last-minute need for a new candidate and so on, well, I'm your man, even though I'd previously promised to stand down and devote all my attention, or at least most of my attention, to my role as leader of the Conservative Party in the Scottish Parliament. This has been an entertaining little story, I think, because it has reminded us that in Scottish politics, nobody really does sort of vicious backstabbing quite as well or with such enthusiasm as the Tories.
Absolutely. Here is a little political hole. Douglas Ross decides not to bring his shovel when he's got a JCB in hand in which to manoeuvre at all. This makes absolutely no sense on any level. Let's just sort of tease out the options here. Douglas Ross wins and he feels vindicated, in which case he goes back in his word and his parliamentary colleagues at Holyrood say, your position as leader here, when you have to be in the House of Commons at some point, is untenable. Is the job of an MP a full-time job? Yes. Is the job of an MSP a full-time job? Yes. There's not enough hours in the day. It's not enough hours in the day to do both. So even if he wins, his colleagues at Holyrood are going to ask serious questions. If he loses, and his decision to fight this gives the SNP a ready-made campaign in that constituency, and I think that voters do not like the idea that they may well be being played, and it looks as if they're being played. If he loses, then his colleagues at Holyrood are also going to say, you're a loser. Do we need a loser leading us into the election in 2026? However you actually analyse this, you simply have to say it's an incomprehensible decision. And just as we were saying about Rishi Sunak in relation to the D-Day issue, does he actually understand politics? I would ask the same question of Douglas Ross.
Yeah, well, greater love hath no man than he lay down the life of a sick colleague for his own political future.
Now you're paraphrasing Jeremy Thorpe there on Macmillan's Night of the Long Knives.
Yeah, well, this is a night of a very short dirk, I suppose. I mean, this has caused great disquiet amongst the Conservative group at Holyrood. There's a lot of Tory MSPs and I think Tory MPs as well who are seriously unhappy about this, not just the decision, but the way it was done as well. This sort of last minute thing the day before nominations had to be put in. And there are serious concerns amongst some Tory MSPs. I mean, a couple have said to me that they think that the manner in which this is done, the brutal assassination, if you like, of David Duguid, will cost the Conservatives the seat. They think that, this was going to be a tough hold anyway, but it was definitely possible. And they now suspect that the SNP's chances of winning it have been improved. And that will be laid firmly and squarely and solely at Douglas Ross's door. And as you say, it's very difficult to see how he emerges from this, win or lose, in a stronger position. It all seems so sort of unnecessary and nasty as well. Again, you're just left to think, well, what were they thinking? Or rather, why weren't they thinking?
Well, the key question for me, just as Rishi Sunak misjudged the situation the other day, there are lots of advisors. Some of the advisors should have said, you can't do this. You can't do this. And anyone senior within the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party who knew that he was on manoeuvres in order to put himself in there should have said, you cannot do this and you need to stop. And the fact that he has been able to do it, well, even if he wins, and he's going to represent the people of that constituency in the House of Commons, and they will expect a full-time MP, not a part-time MP. And of course, today in the newspapers, although IPSA have, I think, already been over some of these expenses, we see briefings against him about previous expense allowances that he's put into from the House of Commons. Again, it goes back to, I think, the very first podcast we did, Alec. Your real enemies are not in front of you, they're behind you.
And that's always the case with the Scottish Tories. And so, but if we're speaking of enemies, and let's move on to somebody else who I think most people are thinking is actually having quite a good campaign, and that is Stephen Flynn, leader of the SNP group in the House of Commons. He had a strong performance in the Seven Little People debate on Friday night. A lot of people thought he won that debate. I mean, and I think, it's fair to say that he came across well, delivered his lines effectively, hit the bruises that he wanted to hit on his opponent's bodies and so on. Although I would caveat all of this with the fact that it's always quite easy for the SNP when they're playing to a largely English audience, because there is very little scrutiny of the SNP's own proposals and even less of its own track record accumulated over 17 years in office. But even if we allow for that and so on, I think Stephen Flynn has had an effective campaign and is probably, perhaps the Nationalists' most effective communicator right now. Wouldn't you agree?
Short answer is yes. I thought when he took over from Ian Blackford, his style...
that was another assassination, of course. Yeah.
Indeed. Indeed it was. I thought that when he was in the chamber at PMQs, he started off by asking very sharp questions, because he knew the way in which the television pictures were going to be edited. And if you ask a question with a whole long preamble, you have to edit it, and it doesn't sound as crisp. When he asked his first couple of questions in the first couple of weeks, I thought, this guy understands television. This guy understands television. And then when we went on, I wasn't quite so sure. But during this election, I have been pretty impressed, I have to say. I'm going to go a stage far. I think that he won that debate hands down. I genuinely do. Mm-hmm. I thought he won it hands down. And I was saying to an individual within the Labour Party just the other day, look at the clapometer in the 7-way debate. Look at the number of rounds of applause that Stephen Flynn got. He got rounds of applause because he took on Farage unambiguously. He made the case for immigration. And of course, the dynamics in Scotland are completely different from south of the border. But every time he was given a round of applause, he was given a round of applause for an issue and a statement that you would have expected to come out of Angela Rayner's mouth. And it didn't come out of Angela Rayner's mouth, who was basically playing it ultra safe by not saying anything terribly much. But as we have discussed before, the Labour strategy in this election is to say nothing in order that there are no targets that can ever give the Conservatives a target where they can actually hit you with something.
Yeah, well, I mean, Labour's position is perfectly sensible. This is the 11th round of a 12-round contest, and they've won the first 10. The only way they can lose is by knockout. Yes, that kind of, if you like, defensive posture is perfectly rational. Elections are not the time to be bringing in big, expansive ideas for how, to open up discussions on how the future of the country might be managed. They just don't work like that. If you think back to 2017, Theresa May's great mistake was, or her first great mistake was the so-called dementia tax, which was a big idea, a big subject that requires proper debate and discussion. The future of social care across the UK is really important, is going to be increasingly important. But at the middle of a general election campaign was the worst possible time to introduce this. And, so Labour are quite right not to be playing adventurously. With regard to Stephen Flynn, there is no secret at Holyrood as well that, Stephen Flynn is a man with a mission. And that mission is to become leader of the SNP. And ideally, in his case, First Minister of Scotland, he has a lean and hungry look about him, doesn't he?
I believe the expression, Alec, given you're a great classicist, is yon Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous.
Yes. No, I don't know if Stephen Flynn thinks too much, but he certainly thinks plenty about his own future ambitions. And the interesting dynamic. I mean, obviously, this is looking well into the future, and so therefore subject to all manner of outrageous fortune and so on. But how long does John Swinney want to be leader of the SNP for? When he succeeded Humza Yousaf, he said, look, I want to make this very clear. I am not a caretaker. I'm going to be in this for the long haul, thereby inviting us to suppose that he would lead the SNP into the 2026 Holyrood election and putatively be prepared to serve 4 or 5 years as First Minister. In other words, John Swinney was saying, I'm going to be the guy for the next 6 or 7 years. Now, I don't know anyone who believes that. Maybe there are some people, but I don't believe anybody in John Swinney's household believes that, let alone elsewhere. And so the question then becomes, how does Stephen Flynn get to Holyrood? And again, it's openly discussed at Holyrood and indeed in Westminster that he would like to stand for the party in 2026 at Holyrood. That then opens the door to him becoming leader of the SNP if the Nationalists have a disappointing result in that election. If the people of Scotland decide that the SNP era is over, then John Swinney steps down, and it's a contest between Stephen Flynn, Kate Forbes perhaps, and maybe one or two others to take on the mantle and to refashion the case for independence for a new generation. Because again, he may have performed very well in that debate on Friday night, but it was very interesting that he didn't mention independence at all. And there are good reasons for the SNP to downplay that at this election. But,
I think you're jumping over a lot of hurdles here about elections, where the results have yet to take place, and internal debates within the SNP that are yet to take place. I don't disagree with much of the analysis. I mean, I would simply say this, that from the point of view of individuals who think about policy, I would score Kate Forbes pretty highly. And this doesn't necessarily, I think, penetrate with the public, who only get a view of politicians by what they see on television. I think she's a serious person for the modern age and thinks deeply about policy. I think that he has an interesting presentational style, which won that debate for me the other night. But and however it pans out and however long John Swinney has got left, I think the issue in the next leadership contest for the SNP, whoever it is, and I would expect that both Kate Forbes and Stephen Flynn would actually feature, is that from 2014 until now, the case for independence has never been higher, and yet is now on the verge of this poll on the 4th of July, almost on the floor, on the SNP's watch. On the SNP's watch. How on earth did that happen? And therefore, the foot soldiers who yearn for independence will simply ask at the next leadership election, what are you going to do to reverse the fortunes of the party on the national question? Because we had this historic opportunity in 2014, and as everybody who's standing for Alapa will be saying at this election, it has been squandered. So yes, they need a political philosophy and a set of policies which are credible in the modern age, but they also have to have a roadmap, at least to a second referendum, or how they get to independence, because that will probably be on the 5th of July at that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the problems, and this is something I suspect we will speak at greater length about in the weeks, months, and hopefully years to come, is that, how does the SNP actually refashion the case for the only policy in which it actually really believes, the only non-negotiable aspect of the SNP's thinking? And I would say, just briefly, because I know we're coming to the end just now, that one of the extraordinary things about the 2014 and the decade after it is the way that the SNP failed to learn any lessons from its defeat and failed to understand why it lost, and then did nothing to address the reasons why it lost, and spent almost no time speaking to people who didn't already agree with the independence proposition. I think that's a fascinating decade of squandered opportunity for all sorts of different reasons, but it's something that I think we'll have to get into another time, probably.
Indeed, we will. And on our next podcast, we're going to be taking viewers' questions, because we've always made the point, and as these podcasts roll out, we really do want to hear what you have to say. We'll take questions. We'll try and answer the questions. We will also, at certain stages in the future, for exchanges that we're having with people, invite them on, because there's not enough space in Scottish politics for people who are not frontline political figures to say what they think in order to have a better public discourse. But for the moment, from Alex and myself, goodbye.
Goodbye.